followers on Instagram which video they want to see first, and they voted that they want to see the video rating you to sleep first. So that's what we're gonna do today. I am gonna be reading you to sleep. So yeah, but before we start this video, I just want to say that I make custom videos. I have a link to my video page in the description box. So if you're interested in ordering a custom video, then you just have to click the link and see for yourself. So yeah, and there's also a sale going on where you can get, I think, 15% off if you order, I think, till Valentine's Day. But yeah, I'll just gonna put everything in the description box. So if you want a custom video, then please check this out. So yeah, with that being said, let's just get into the video. And like I said, today I'm gonna be reading you to sleep. And I have this book here with me. As you can see, it's Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone by J.K. Rowling. And I think everyone knows this book. And if you don't, I think you're like living on a rock or something. But yeah, I actually never really was that into Harry Potter. I never watched the films or read the books or something. But we have to read this in school in our English class. And I thought this would be like a good book to read. And there, you can see on the cover, there's Harry, there's Hermione, I think that's Ron, and I forgot what his name was. Hagrid, that's Hagrid. Okay, well, and there's Hogwarts, of course. But yeah, today I'm gonna be reading, I think, like the first 2 chapters, but we're just gonna see how long it takes me to read. But yeah, maybe I'll do a he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owls swooping past in broad daylight, though people down in the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed as owl after owl sped overhead. Most of them had never even seen an owl, even at night time. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people. He made several important telephone calls and shouted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he would stretch his legs and walk across the road to buy himself a bun from the baker's opposite. He had forgotten all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the baker's. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him uneasy. This lot were whispering excitedly too, and he couldn't see a single collecting tin. It was on his way back past them, clutching a large dognut in a bag. Then he got a few words of what they were saying. The Potters, that's right, that's what I heard. Yes, their son Harry. Mr. Dursley stopped dead. Fear flooded him. He looked back at the whispers as he wanted to say something to them, but thought better of it. He dashed back across the road, hurried up to his office, snapped at his secretary not to disturb him, seized his telephone, and had almost finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down and stroked his mustache, thinking, no, he was being stupid. Potter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure there were lots of people called Potter who had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't even sure his nephew was called Harry. He had never even seen this boy. It might have been Harvey or Harold. There was no point in worrying Mrs. Dursley. She always got so upset at any mention of her sister. He didn't blame her if he had a sister like that, but all the same, those people in cloaks. He found it a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon, and when he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still so worried Dursley. Well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with, her lot. Mrs. Dursley sipped her tea through pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared to tell her he'd heard the name Potter. He decided he didn't dare. Instead, he said, as casually as he could, "Their son. He'd be about Dudley's age now, wouldn't he?" "I suppose so," said Mrs. Dursley stiffly. "What's his name again? Howard, isn't it? Harry. Nasty, common name, if you ask me." "Oh, yes," said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking horribly. "Yes, I quite agree." He didn't say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept to the bedroom window and peered down into the front garden. The cat was still there. It was staring down Private Drive as though it was waiting for something. Was he imagining things? Could all this have anything to do with the Potters? If it did, if it got out that they were related to a pair of... Well, he didn't think he could bear it. The Dursleys got into bed. Mrs. Dursley fell asleep quickly, but Mr. Dursley lay awake, turning it all over in his mind. His last comforting thought before he fell asleep was that even if the Potters